Throughout the colonies, people are preparing to defend themselves. Since the founding of the colonies, each province has had a militia to deal with local emergencies. Leaders of the protest now gain control of these militia and seize stores of guns and ammunition. Nicholas Cresswell, an English traveler, finds himself inconvenienced by the turmoil.
The people here are ripe for revolt. I hear nothing but oaths against England and her friends. The king is cursed in public. Everywhere the talk is of raising men and of war. Oh, at dinner I had a long argument with Mr. Jackson about the cause of all these troubles. I got the better of him, but I now realize he was simply trying to draw out my opinions. Now they all suspect me of being what they call a Tory spy. They watch my every move, and I'm threatened with tar and feathers and the devil knows what else. To add to my troubles, I have found that moths have eaten large holes in 2 of my suits. I have a violent pain. I must take a dose of salts. I vow never to talk politics again until I leave these cursed provinces.
In Massachusetts, where General Gage's troops still occupy Boston, the citizens are becoming increasingly defiant.
The Americans reacted stronger and stronger. It was a step of degree by degree. They would yell at the British on the street. They would walk up to the British at night in the taverns and give them their opinion of what they thought. It was getting worse and worse. And the British reacted. The British government told Gage, go out and show these local farmers what it's all about. The king's troops enforce the king's law. Get out there beyond Boston and show them what it's like.
April 19th, 1775. General Gage decides to send 700 soldiers into the countryside to capture a cache of arms. It is to be a minor operation. Their destination? Concord. A Boston silversmith, Paul Revere, and others hear of it and spread the word to the surrounding communities. On Lexington Green, the rebel militia under Captain Parker turns out to meet the British troops.
And the British officers came up and went forward to Parker and they said, disperse ye rebels. Parker looked at his measly lineup of men versus this royal line with bayonets that were facing him. He turned to his troops and said, disperse. And they turned and started to disperse and walk away. And then someone fired the shot.
No one to this day knows who fired the first shot at Lexington, but perhaps a farmer tripped over his musket in retreating. Clearly the colonials were giving ground. A gun went off, and then the British troops began firing. Their officers lost control of them.
Some of the British line fired, the Americans fired back, men dropped on both sides, and the battle had begun. The Americans ran, the British advanced with the bayonet, and the battle was all over.
No one had given orders for the attack. No one had given orders for the reply. But on this day, on Lexington Green, a political argument among members of the same family has become a blood feud. The British continue on to Concord to complete their work of capturing the store of munitions. By this time, word is out. The British are coming. The colonists swarm in around them. For the first time, the British are faced with a problem central to the entire revolution. How to subdue not just another army, but a population in rebellion.
Even the women had rifles. The enthusiastic zeal with which those people have behaved must convince every reasonable man what a difficult and unpleasant task we have before us. Arms will never enforce obedience, and only God in his infinite mercy can restore peace to this country again.
269 British soldiers are killed or wounded. the remains of their forces limp back to Boston.
Lexington-Concord need not, I suppose, have been as major event as it was, but it came to be that. At the time, everyone understood that it was a major change.
Well, it initiated the revolution. There was no turning back from that moment on, it seemed. Once you had bloodshed, and the thing just started escalating. The suspicion, the anger, it couldn't be stopped, it seemed. Although there were efforts made, of course, still.
Throughout the colonies, news of Lexington and Concord spreads like wildfire. From all over New England, volunteers assemble. They march towards Boston and build camps across the river from the city. At Mount Vernon, George Washington writes to a close friend in England.
The brother's sword has been sheathed in the brother's breast. We now have a sad choice. Either we are to live as slaves, or the once happy plains of America are to be drenched in blood.
In May 1775, a second Continental Congress meets in emergency session.
The delegates that come to Philadelphia again are in a state of agitation and anxiety. It's much different than a year ago. For them, a die is being cast and the game is getting much more dangerous than anyone ever anticipated.
It is becoming clear that England will not back down. Congress decides that it must form a national army. It adopts the ragtag collection of volunteers camped around Boston. The choice of a general to lead this new army is crucial. John Hancock, as one of the wealthiest men in the colonies, feels he is the obvious choice. He is pleased when his fellow New Englander, John Adams, rises to nominate a candidate.
I told them that I had but one gentleman in mind. Someone whose skill and experience, whose independent fortune, great talents, and excellent character would win the approval of all of America and unite the colonies better than any other person in the Union. As I spoke, I watched Hancock's face as he listened to me with visible pleasure. When I announced that this gentleman was from Virginia, his expression suddenly changed from pleasure to mortification and resentment. His mood was not helped when Samuel Adams seconded the motion.
John Adams would tell you that he made George Washington. But John Adams would tell you he made the revolution as well. John Adams, very adroitly, knowing that it was necessary to bring Virginia enthusiastically into the war, stood up and proposed a Virginian to command this New England army on Cambridge Common. And of course, everyone knew who that was. It was George Washington, who was conveniently enough standing there wearing his Virginia colonel's uniform, almost as a billboard of his availability.
George Washington certainly looks the part. At 6'3", he towers over the other delegates. Unfortunately, his record as an officer leaves much to be desired.
Certainly he had served in the military. His defeat at Fort Necessity began the French and Indian War for all practical purposes. He was there at Braddock's defeat, 1755. I mean, it wasn't, he'd never commanded a successful operation of a major scale. He had military experience, yes, but it's a measure of how little successful large-scale military experience the Americans had, at least in terms of command, that he looked relatively qualified for this position.
Before setting out for Cambridge to take command of the army, the 43-year-old Washington sends a letter to his wife, Martha, at home in Mount Vernon.
Dearest Patsy, I am embarked on a wide ocean from which no safe harbor is to be found. As life is always uncertain, and common prudence dictates to every man the necessity of settling his temporal concerns, And, while the mind is calm and undisturbed, I have gotten Colonel Pendleton to draft a will, which I now enclose. The provision made for you in case of my death will, I hope, be agreeable. P.S. You will be happy to know that I've bought 2 suits of what I am told is the finest cloth. I am sure you will be pleased to hear that I paid 50 shillings a suit, which comes out to only 20 shillings a yard.
As Congress deliberates, the first major battle of the American Revolution is about to begin. The New England militia forces have moved in to occupy Breed's Hill and Bunker Hill on the Charlestown Peninsula. Their guns now threaten the British Navy anchored in Boston Harbor. The British respond by burning nearby Charlestown. Then 2,000 British soldiers charge uphill towards the American positions. The American forces, having the advantage of height, fire down on the advancing redcoats. Line after line of British soldiers are mowed down.
The British charged up Bunker Hill really in defiance of their own military theory. As we know, their soldiers fought best on level surfaces where they could maneuver into lines 3 deep and fire and volley. They never had that opportunity when they were charging up Bunker Hill. I have a feeling, had they not been opposed by provincials whom they didn't respect, they never would have attempted that charge, which resulted in such terrible carnage during their first 2 efforts to ascend the hill.
The important thing was, they found out these stubborn old Yankees would fight. These stubborn old Yankees meant what they said, and had the courage not only to fight that day, but to challenge the superiority and the sovereignty of the British arms. This was a major, major step, psychologically as well as militarily.
When their ammunition runs out, the Americans flee. The British finally take Bunker Hill. It is a costly victory. More than 1/3 of their troops have been killed or wounded. The farm of John and Abigail Adams is only 9 miles from the center of the fighting. Refugees stream into the normally peaceful countryside. Abigail Adams writes to her husband in Philadelphia. This is her first taste of war.
Dearest friend, our little house is now a scene of confusion. Soldiers coming in for lodgings, exhausted refugee women and children from Boston seeking shelter. Oh, John, you cannot imagine how we're living, not knowing what the next day, the next hour will bring. Until now, I have managed to maintain a calmness, but I cannot trust myself much longer, with terrors intruding on my mind. I'm not going to ask you when you're coming back. The fate of our country depends on your wisdom. But your absence awakens in me all the love of the years we've been together. It breaks from my heart, and not knowing how to brook any restraint flows through my pen. This is but the first scene of what may be a great tragedy. May heaven spare my family and spare my most beloved friend.
As both sides are recovering from Bunker Hill, General Washington arrives in Cambridge to take command of his army.
Washington is a man of enormous, aggressive instincts. Washington would like nothing better than to go to Boston and charge, into Boston and bayonet the British and drive them out of the city. He arrives there and he finds he has no capacity to do that.
The officers are, in general, the most indifferent kind of people I ever saw. The men, I dare say, would fight well if properly led, although they're exceedingly dirty and nasty people.
He didn't find an army, he found a shantytown. Men sleeping out in the open, some of them going home for days at a time and coming back. He found a lack of powder, a lack of uniforms. Not all the men even had arms. Many of the men coming into camp would be carrying sickles and scythes, whatever they had. So Washington had an army that wasn't an army. It was a bunch of citizens together with a common cause, but certainly none of the professionalism that he really needed to begin to build it.
It was a democratical army. It was an army that elected its own officers. And popular sovereignty has many advantages, but it's probably not a military virtue, particularly when you're about to face the greatest empire on the face of the earth.
An officer must shake every man by the hand and beg and say, "Pray, brother, pray, friend, would you kindly do this or that?" When a few hearty damns to these damn people would have much better effect.
Well, Washington decided he had to impose discipline. But he had officers not worthy of the name, and so he did it himself. He was his own quartermaster. But more than that, I mean, he was doing things that lieutenants and sergeants would do in another army. He was issuing daily orders to make certain that the necessaries were emptied every week, that there was clean straw for bedding, that men did not consort with the enemy, that they in fact were the enemy, and you were not to fraternize with them.
Washington is also shocked to find blacks and whites together. He is, after all, a slave owner. But he soon learns that he will need every soldier he can get.
Once the Continental Army gave the states their quotas, which the states could not meet, or perhaps manpower did not want to meet, then they began to call on, very quietly at first, call on black troops. The states declared to the slaves in the North that if they would fight, then they would be given their freedom.
God forgive me for doing so, but I ran away from my master, and I'm now enlisted in the American Army. Maybe if the master had taught me to read the words of the Gospels, "Servants, obey your master," I wouldn't have done it. I might not have heard those songs of liberty that saluted my ears and thrilled through my heart. But I'm here. I've been working horse and wagon, supplying the armies near Danbury with provisions for 4 months. I'm now serving my country faithfully.
Over 25,000 black soldiers will fight on both sides during the American Revolution. In time, a full 1/5 of the American northern regiments will be black. It will be the most racially integrated war fought by Americans until the 20th century. The real possibility of a full-scale war with England is beginning to sink in. Many people in the colonies are becoming desperate for reconciliation. John Dickinson, an early activist and one of John Adams' personal heroes, now urges Congress to send one more petition to England.
We have an excellent king. England is a generous, sensible, and humane nation to whom we can bring our complaints. Artful men may be deceiving them, making them angry at us, but I cannot believe that they are cruel or unjust. Let us behave like dutiful children who have received undeserved blows from a beloved parent. Let us complain to our parent, but let our complaints speak in a language of affection and veneration.
These petitions are a fruitless waste of time. We should be finding supplies of gunpowder instead. While we petition the people of Boston, imprisoned within the walls of the city, suffer we know not what cruelties at the hands of His Majesty's army. John Dickinson and the gentlemen of Pennsylvania say that they are ardently with us. But as they see the break with England approaching, they start back. I see terror in their eyes.
What is the reason, Mr. Adams, that you New England men oppose our attempts at reconciliation with the British? If you don't agree with us, we are prepared to break off from you New Englanders and carry on our opposition to England in our own way.
There had been no common bond among the colonies previous to the revolutionary movement except their common tie with England. If you took that away, what would you have? Chaos. If there is no common authority capable of holding this miscellaneous collection of communities together, what will happen? Already Connecticut people and Pennsylvania people were at war in the western reaches of what is now western Pennsylvania over territorial wars. Borders were disputed. What would happen to Vermont? Was Vermont going to be part of New York? Was it going to be allowed to go separately? What was going to happen? There was one internal dispute after another that had somehow to be settled. Shouldn't we settle these first? Dickinson said, we can't agree on anything. We're in a terrible situation to try to send our ship off into the sea independently. We need Britain. We need Britain to hold ourselves together.
Dickinson drafts a petition bypassing Parliament. Addressed directly to the king, it pleads with him to intervene and settle the dispute. Known as the Olive Branch Petition, it is seen as the last hope for peace.
Attached to your Majesty's person, family, and government, with all devotion that principle and affection can inspire.
Despite John Adams' objections, the petition is approved by Congress on July 5, 1775.
That we most ardently desire that the former harmony between her and these colonies may be restored.
I was walking to the State House, and I met Dickinson at Chestnut Street. We came near enough to touch elbows. I took off my hat and bowed. He passed haughtily by without moving his hat or head or hand. I suppose we'll not be on speaking terms or bowing terms for some time to come.
It takes over a month for the king to receive the Olive Branch Petition.
Attached to your Majesty's person, family, and government with all devotion that principle and affection can inspire, connected with Great Britain by the strongest ties that can unite societies.
At the same time, the king is receiving other news. The Americans have slaughtered British soldiers at Bunker Hill. They have formed a national army. Renegades have seized forts on the Hudson River and are preparing to attack British bases in Canada. King George is getting a double message from America.
That the former harmony between her and these colonies may be restored. Well, the die is now cast. These New England governments are in a state of rebellion. Good. I am not sorry. The lines have been drawn. Now blows must decide whether they're to be our subjects or independent.
The king declares the colonists enemies, outside of his protection. The British Navy is ordered to attack New England's seaport towns. They bombard Falmouth in what is now Maine, burning it to the ground. Congress is stunned. Benjamin Franklin writes to his closest friend in England.
To William Streatham, you are a member of Parliament, one of the majority that has doomed my country to destruction. Look at the blood on your hands. It is the blood of your family. We were once good friends. You are now my enemy.
Nobody in the colonies really knows what to do next. At this moment of hesitation, a 50-page pamphlet is published which will change the course of history. Written by Thomas Paine, an obscure journalist recently arrived from England, it is called Common Sense.
It's surprising But nothing will clear up our situation so quickly, so efficiently, as an open and determined declaration for independence. Until this happens, we are like that man who puts off some unpleasant business day after day. He knows it has to be done. He hates to start doing it. He wishes it were all over, and he's haunted by the fact that he knows he has no other choice. The blood of those already killed cries out for it. It is time to part.
Tom Paine was born in England in 1738. He attempted several careers, from corset maker to customs collector. He was a failure at all of them. When he came to Philadelphia in 1774, he brought with him a burning rage against the privileged classes and against the injustice of the British political system.
Paine, of course, is a political radical and a very definitely what I suppose would probably be called a loose cannon in America, the kind of person you're embarrassed to have on your side. Paine is a subversive. You know, if you're a respectable slave-owning, plantation-owning gentleman, not necessarily a natural friend. Tom Paine is not the kind of man you invite to tea at Mount Vernon.
He was a common man, a laboring man, and a well-read man besides, but certainly not of the caliber of the other patriots, who were well-born merchants, planters. He was not of that socioeconomic class, and that perhaps gave him an insight into the Republican ideals as they really should have been lived, which the other patriots didn't have. Many of the patriots consider the people rabble. For Paine, the common people were the revolution. The simplicity of the language and common sense made revolution something that was available to everyone and that everyone was a part of.
Paine is not only calling for independence, he is also proposing a radical new idea, that ordinary people can understand and participate in government, that they do not need a king.
When planning for the future, let us remember King George, that sottish, stubborn, worthless, brutal man, the sceptred savage of Great Britain. Remember that virtue and ability are not hereditary.
It was that transformation of government that was at the kernel of the revolutionary character of the American Revolution. Paine would say that in later times, said the independence alone would not have made much difference, but the establishment of a government in which authority was given to the people made the American Revolution an event of world significance.
We have it in our power to begin the world anew. It is the opportunity to bring forward a system of government in which the rights of all men should be preserved, that gives value to independence. O ye that love mankind, ye that dares oppose not only the tyranny but the tyrant, stand forth. America shall make a stand, not for herself alone, but for the world.
Common Sense instantly becomes the greatest bestseller the country has ever known. Parts of it are reprinted in newspapers around the country. It is read aloud after church, in taverns, and at town meetings. Officers read it to their troops. From meeting houses in New England, to farms in Delaware, to the streets of Williamsburg, Virginia, ordinary people are making their voices heard. The tide is turning in favor of independence. Over the next months, the talk is not only about separation from king and parliament. People are beginning to imagine what form a new government might take. Abigail Adams writes to her husband,
Dearest friend, in the new laws which you will be writing, please remember the ladies. Don't put unlimited power in the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if you give them a chance. If you don't pay attention to the ladies, then you cannot expect us to obey any laws in which we don't have a voice or representation.
Well, well. We were warned that our struggle with England is going to let everyone loose. Children are going to become disobedient. Students will overthrow their teachers. Negroes and Indians will become insolent to their masters. But now I see a new tribe, more numerous and powerful than all the others, is beginning to rebel.
Dearest friend, I'm sorry, but I still find it odd that while you are proclaiming peace and goodwill to men, emancipating the nation, you still insist on retaining the absolute power of husbands over their wives. Remember, John, arbitrary power, like everything else that's hard and brittle, is easily broken. In spite of all your wise laws, we too have it in our power to free ourselves.
Throughout the colonies, royal governors are under attack. They can get no support from the British Army, which is concentrated in Massachusetts. Except in Boston, power is soon largely in the hands of local patriots. In one colony after another, a new flag is flying. It has 13 stripes, but the Union Jack is still in the corner. With all that has happened, the colonists continue to see themselves as British subjects. The Continental Congress had been called as an ad hoc committee, but it has become a government almost by accident. Its members now find themselves running a fledgling army, advising the states on setting up governments, building roads, and running the post office. But the delegates still cannot bring themselves to take the final step.
Like the proverbial Mrs. Bickle, we tremble on our wedding night. But at least Mrs. Bickle realizes that there's no turning back. She musters up her spirits, commits her soul to Jesus and her body to Mr. Bickle, and leaps into bed.
In March 1776, Congress receives startling news. The British have evacuated Boston and are regrouping for a massive invasion of New York City. General Washington rushes to New York to set up defenses. The moment cannot be put off any longer. The time has come to make a formal declaration of independence from England. The delegates know that this is also a declaration of war.
All of them felt that their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor, as they said on the record, all those were at stake. I think they meant it. I think they thought they would probably die, and if they didn't die, that they would be disgraced in some way that made the stakes very, very high for them.
To prepare the declaration, the delegates appoint a committee, including Benjamin Franklin and John Adams. One member is a man who has not spoken one word in Congress, a shy planter and sometime architect, Thomas Jefferson. When it comes to actually writing the final document, Adams defers to Jefferson.
First reason, you are a Virginian, and a Virginian ought to appear at the head of this business. Second reason, I am obnoxious and unpopular. You are well liked. Third reason, you can write 10 times better than I can.
Borrowing ideas from English philosophers, the Virginia Declaration of Rights, and the spirit of Tom Paine, Jefferson writes the first draft in a day.
I see my job as trying to bring together and harmonize a variety of different opinions. We are putting before all of mankind in words that are both simple and firm a justification for the stand that we're being forced to take.
After long debate, Congress changes much of the document, but leaves untouched Jefferson's stirring preamble. He has taken what was to be a simple declaration of the colony's independence from England and turned it into something that will change the world forever.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
The Declaration of Independence was obviously more than a simple separation of these 13 states from the British monarchy. Its preface expressed sentiments that have become the basis of all of our beliefs. Equality lay at the heart of their endeavor. It's equality of not paying attention to whom you married, who your father was, who your patron was. This renunciation of this kind of hierarchical world lay at the heart of the revolution. Now, the implications of that, they hadn't fully seen. Many, of course, had no sense that all men and women are equal, nor did they think that all white men and black men are equal. But nonetheless, they do posit this notion of equality, which turns out to be a very permissive doctrine and can be picked up by hosts of people who would use it in ways that many of these revolutionary leaders never anticipated.
The War of the American Revolution was not the first war about ideas, because after all there had been many wars of religion, and these were essentially about ideas, about philosophies. But I think the War of Independence I think it ended as the first truly political war. It may not have begun so, it may have been about other things, about taxes or about indirect rule from London. It may have been about grievances, but it became a war about ideas. Once they declared their independence, and once they started to think about the future form that the United States would take, once they began to see America, the America that was going to be as different from the Europe that was, then it became a political war, and ended, of course, by being, I think, a completely political war. America was going to be independent, but it was going to be a new sort of organization, a new sort of state. And there'd never been that in the world before.
On July 2nd, 1776, Congress resolves that the colonies are to be independent from England. 2 days later, on July 4th, the delegates adopt the Declaration of Independence. John Adams makes a prediction to his wife.
The second day of July, 1776, ought to be commemorated by succeeding generations as the Day of Deliverance. It ought to be celebrated by pomp and parade, with shows and games, sports, bells, bonfires, and illuminations from one end of this continent to the other, from this time forward forevermore. Now you'll think that I'm getting carried away with enthusiasm, but I am not. I am well aware of the toil, the blood, and the treasure that it will cost us to maintain this declaration. Yet through all the gloom, I can see the rays of ravishing light and glory. I can see that the end is more than worth the means. Posterity will triumph in this day's business, even though we may regret it. I trust in God we shall not.
War is coming. New Yorkers watch the harbor with apprehension.
I'm sitting in the outhouse, which has a good view of the harbor. I get my discharge, and then I look out the window. Well, I can't believe my eyes. It's like a forest of pine trees are moving in out there. In 10 minutes, the whole bay is full of ships. Looks like all London is floated here.
30,000 troops, 10,000 sailors, 300 supply ships, 30 battleships with 1,200 cannon. It is the largest seaborne attack ever attempted by England until the 20th century.
A whole host of emotions must have gone through Americans, wondering, did they have the stuff to take on the largest army, the largest empire in the world. And seeing this huge force, realizing that the British were not going to let this empire go without a big fight, it must have been a terrifying and frightening moment in July of 1776.
News of the Declaration of Independence reaches Ambrose Searle, Secretary to Admiral Howe of the British Navy.
We are presently at anchor in full view of New York and the rebel headquarters under Washington. We heard that Congress has announced that the colonies are to be independent states. The madness of these deluded people.
As far as the British were concerned, there was both an emotional and a practical response to American independence. The emotional response is, how dare they? How dare they? You know, that the British had fought to clear the French out of North America, that these people were subjects of the British Crown, that this was totally unacceptable.
King George is determined to restore British sovereignty to the colonies. But he is reluctant to wage an all-out war.
War was a war against foreigners. War is real war. War is a war against national enemies. But the Americans weren't foreigners. They were Englishmen, Scotsmen. They were the king's subjects, deluded perhaps, misguided, troublesome, turbulent, inconvenient, but not foreigners, not an enemy, not people you could or should think in terms of fighting a war against.
The British forces are led by two brothers. Viscount Richard Howe heads the Navy. Sir William Howe leads the Army. They plan a demonstration of British naval power, fully confident that this will force the rebels to the bargaining table. July 12, 1776. Admiral Howe orders two of his frigates, the Phoenix and the Rose, to sail up the Hudson, guns blazing.
The roar of the cannon is so terrible that many in our army and navy have never heard anything like it before. Apparently, the rebels were frightened by the din. The whole scene is awful, grand, I might even say beautiful, except for the sad fact that people's lives are at stake, even if they are the lowest of criminals.
After this show of force, the Howes send out peace feelers to General Washington. Surely now he will be willing to negotiate. They meet at Colonel Henry Knox's headquarters on Broadway.
Under a flag of truce, General Washington met with no less than the Adjutant General of Howe's army. He informed our commander that Lord Howe had come to New York with great powers to pardon those in rebellion. General Washington told him that he had come to the wrong place. The Americans had not offended, therefore they needed no pardon. This confused the adjutant. Has Your Excellency no particular message which you would honor me to convey to Lord and General Howe? Nothing, sir, but my compliments to them both, replied Washington, upon which he bowed, and they parted on the most genteel terms imaginable.
The message is clear. The Americans will not back down. This means war. A war which will begin here in New York City.
New York was virtually indefensible for the Americans. It was an island. We didn't have a navy. The British had a navy. It was one of the most difficult locales for Washington to even conceive of defending. I think he would have preferred not to have tried, but the Continental Congress felt that some show had to be made, and he agreed.
The British must wait 2 months for all their ships and supplies to arrive. Meanwhile, they stage on Staten Island. In the sweltering New York summer, the soldiers train. Led by officers in heavy wool coats and wigs, they parade in full battle dress. They write home about the heat, the ferocious mosquitoes, and the American women.
The fair nymphs on Staten Island are fresh meat for our men. A girl cannot step into the bushes to pick a rose without risk of being ravaged. We have the most entertaining court-martials every day.
The British are joined by 8,000 German troops, known as Hessians. With a reputation for being savage fighters, these soldiers are rented from German princes for £7 a head. The British forces are among the biggest, best trained, and toughest armies in the world. They believe Washington's troops will present no serious opposition.
A lot of the generals had been to America because they had been fighting in the 7 Years' War, in the French and Indian War, and their opinion of colonial troops was on the whole pretty low. They didn't think much of colonial troops, and, you know, who were the senior officers of the colonial militia? Men like Major Washington, who'd surrendered the moment he'd met the French the first time. This was the kind of thing which didn't inspire confidence among experienced professional soldiers, and they tended to take the view that colonial troops were all very well as long as you kept them out of the way of the enemy.
The men who joined the American Army could not be more different from the hardened career soldiers of the British Army. The Americans come with a variety of motives. Some are patriotic. Some are just in search of adventure. A typical soldier is Joseph Plum Martin, a young farmer from Connecticut. In a diary which he will keep for the 7 years of the war, he records the day of his enlistment.
Last year when I saw my friends marching off, I went home, bit my fingernails, imagining them all telling me of their exploits, swaggering home, their hairbreadth escapes. So I took up a pen, made my mark, and joined. You know, they make you sign up for a whole year. I was just hoping to get a priming before I took on the whole coat of paint of a soldier.
The soldiers come from all over. The sovereign state of Maryland, the plantations of Virginia, and the wilderness of New Hampshire. Many young men have never been away from home. They are meeting people from other states for the first time in their lives.
You know, they put me in this regiment, half New Englanders and half Pennsylvanians. These folks as different as night and day. And myself, I'd rather be fighting with a tribe of Indians than with these Southerners. I mean, they're foreigners. Can hardly speak English. They don't like me either. And they call me that damn Yankee. That's about the nicest thing they say.
One has to remember that in 1776, Americans are not in any way one nation yet. In fact, most people would have thought of their nation, if they talked in those terms, or of their country, as Virginia or Connecticut or Massachusetts, and their loyalties were to their province, which had, each of them had its own long history. And I think that was a question that a lot of people wondered in 1776 about the term American. Just how American are they, and whether they weren't Virginians and Massachusetts and Connecticut people first.
The general has heard that jealousies have arisen among the troops from the different provinces. Name-calling, which causes irritation and can only serve to hurt the noble cause in which we are all engaged. The provinces are all united to oppose a common enemy. All distinctions must be sunk in the name American. George Washington.
Washington's goal is to forge a united and professional army. He is fiercely determined that the British see him as a general worthy of the name. In 18th century terms, that also means being a proper gentleman.
There's no character in the Revolution who is so obsessed with doing what was proper, what the best people thought was the right thing to do. One of his first books that he owned was, and that he copied out assiduously at the age of 16, were rules of etiquette from a courtesy manual. Washington is a man of intense self-will, very quick to anger, but he controlled it. Almost his whole career is an act of will. The reason he behaved the way he did, sometimes in a wooden-like fashion, was because he was trying to live up to what he saw was the ideal classical image of a hero.
Of course, the great part of the problem was that the British had not treated the American officers like gentlemen before the war, when they had been mere provincial officers. And it's often said that if only the British had made George Washington a regular colonel in the armed forces of the Crown, he wouldn't have been a revolutionary at all. Indeed, might have been fighting energetically to put the rebellion down.
One observer is Nicholas Cresswell, an English traveller.
I met Washington, you know. Before the war, I visited him at Mount Vernon. He's an honest man, no vices, except, of course, ambition. He's not well educated, he doesn't speak very well, but there is something about him that makes people close to him very loyal. Look at how he's managed to hold together all those stubborn, headstrong groups he's had to work with.
August 21st. An American spy reports to Washington that Lower Long Island, what is now Brooklyn, will be the first target of the British. Washington rushes in reinforcements.
We immediately start fortifying our positions. Fear is a great inspiration for hard work. I have my gun, canteen, knapsack, and a blanket. It's my first battle. Will I be able to kill someone else?
The next morning, under cover of the formidable guns of the British Navy, 15,000 British troops land unopposed at the southern tip of Long Island. Waiting behind defensive barricades 3 miles away are the Americans. They are outnumbered 2 to 1. The British regiments, in dense formation, march up the open fields toward the heights. Their plan? To crush the rebellion in one decisive battle.
The British advance to within about 300 yards of us and begin a very heavy fire. Bullets and shells fly very fast, now and then taking off a head.
It's very, very difficult to reconstruct these extraordinary battles of the past. But they did indeed form up in dense ranks, very carefully ordered. They did march up to within musket shot of each other with the officers in front. And they did fire at each other at very close range indeed. A man firing at another 100 yards away had almost no chance of hitting him. The ball might go anywhere. So the only way you could be certain of inflicting casualties on the enemy was to mass your men as closely as possible together. So both sides formed up into compact clumps and fired at each other, each hoping that the other would run away.
Once you would have loaded for the first volley, fired your first volley, returned your musket and reloaded, the noise was such that there was no hearing anything. You couldn't hear commands. You'd be very lucky if you could hear a drum beat, for instance, which was one of the reasons they used drums for various commands once the volleying started. But it was then fire at will, and you just kept firing until you heard either a drum beat or somebody yelling in your ear, cease fire, cease fire. There was no organization after about the third volley.
The Patriots hold the high ground. They shoot down on the advancing enemy soldiers. The British realize that they must change tactics or suffer heavy casualties.
Howe was a professional. When he came over with his troops, he immediately sent out his light dragoons to scout the territory. He also had some local Tories that were guiding him, and they found out that the passway over on the American left was virtually unguarded. The Americans, not knowing any topography, they just slipped up, and they left the Jamaica Pass unguarded.
With half their forces in the front, keeping the Americans occupied, a division of 10,000 British soldiers marches undetected through the Jamaica Pass to a position behind the American lines.
Our men stand amazingly well until 12 o'clock, when the main party of British, by a route we never dreamt of, surround us.
Suddenly they looked around, and here was Howe's army coming up behind them. Here was Howe's army coming up on the side. They had to control the line. Which way could they fire? They simply broke and they ran.
The Americans have only one escape route, through the Gowanus Marsh. The British slaughter the fleeing soldiers.
I can't describe the confusion and the horror of the scene. Artillery flying, our men running in every direction, and everywhere we turn we meet the British or the Hessians. Men up to their knees in mud, screaming for help. Everyone else running to save their own skins.
It was a catastrophe. And partly it's American amateurism at fighting this kind of big battle. They'd never fought a battle on that scale before. They'd never had an organization that was designed to fight that kind of battle before. This is new, and they got clobbered.
The rebels have courage, but British discipline wins the day. They're raw troops, never seen action before. Their officers have no understanding of the strategies of war. The Maryland soldiers were from the best families in the province. They were heroes, cut down in the bloom of their youth. The pursuit and slaughter lasted for many hours.
At that moment, in late August of 1776, it really looks as if you're going to lose the war in the first battle, just as the British commanders had predicted you would. British planning is based on the idea of one big decisive battle, and this looks like it, the Battle of Long Island.
The Americans have retreated to Brooklyn Heights. Facing them is the British Army. At their backs is the East River. Almost the entire Continental Army is trapped. The British wait for Washington to surrender.
In the 18th century, in European warfare, it wasn't just a question of winning, but it was also a question of how you won. In a way, it was better to lose well than to win badly. That was they thought the form and ritual of warfare was very important, and wished to behave like gentlemen at all times.
According to the gentlemanly rules of warfare, Washington should concede defeat. Instead, when night falls and a thick fog blankets the East River, he orders his troops to keep all their campfires burning. Then, quietly, he begins to ferry men, horses, and cannon back to Manhattan, a few boatloads at a time. By morning, the entire American army has crossed over to New York.
And the British finally discovered that the fortifications were no longer occupied. They rushed through down to the bank just as the last boat was pulling away. And the last man in the last boat was George Washington.
The British are stunned.
Washington should be very grateful to General Howe. What a kind enemy we are. Instead of crushing the frightened, trembling enemy at once, he generously gives him time to recover from his panic and regroup. 20,000 of our best men stand on the banks of the East River, like Moses looking at the promised land, with the rebel flags waving insolently in the air. The troops and officers couldn't believe that they were just standing there, not doing anything.
The American army may have escaped capture, but the British now occupy Brooklyn Heights. Their guns are trained on New York. Washington realizes that the city cannot be held. His soldiers grab everything they can, including the city's church bells, to be melted into bullets, and begin a retreat up Manhattan Island. The British move in to occupy New York City.
You can't imagine the joy of the city's inhabitants when we march in. Pure bedlam. They carry the king's officers on their shoulders. A woman pulls down the rebels' hated flag and stamps on it with contempt and indignation.
Most New Yorkers are fervently loyal to England, not to the Revolution. Indeed, about 1/5 of the entire American population will remain loyalists throughout the war. They must keep their political views to themselves in areas where patriots are in control. But here in New York, it is the supporters of the Revolution who must keep quiet or leave.
We have fled. It was raining and thundering so hard we had to stop by the side of the road all night. When we did find a place to stay, all we got was a dirty bed on the floor. It's very hard for us that are used to living comfortable.
Travelers will carry the accounts of the disaster in New York along the dirt roads and rivers of 18th century America. It will take over a month for the news to spread to all 13 states. Near Boston, an anxious Abigail Adams writes to her husband John in Congress in Philadelphia.
My dearest friend, there are so many rumors flying around that it is impossible to know what to believe. Did you think that we would be able to hold on to Long Island? If we could not hold Long Island, are they going to take New York City? And if they hold New York, will they be able to cut off New England from the rest of the colonies?
My best friend, I assure you that we in Congress are as much at a loss to understand what happened in New York as you are. In general, our generals were out-generaled on Long Island. Every time our militia see the British, they very courageously panic, turn their backs, and run away. Our Massachusetts men behave just as badly as everyone else.
As the British move in to occupy New York City, the Continental Army continues its retreat up through the countryside of Manhattan Island. It is not an orderly withdrawal. Troops that Washington has positioned to protect the rear of his fleeing army are themselves running at the first sight of British guns. Washington explodes into a rage.
It's one of the few times he really lost his temper. He threw his hat on the ground, he was on horseback. He yelled at them, screamed at them. He had his horse whip, and he was actually whipping some of the officers as well as the men. And finally, he just gave up. All of this terrible pressure and disgust on him, he just sat there limply with Hessians coming at him just 80 yards away. And at that point, one of his aides-de-camp grabbed his horse and led him away.
Washington is forced to accept the fact that he will not be able to conduct a proper European-style war because he does not have a European-style army. He is beginning to realize that he can't expect volunteer soldiers fighting for liberty to blindly follow orders. He will have to persuade them.
Well, this means that you have a different kind of an army, a more democratical army, maybe a more equalitarian army, maybe. And in some ways, it was a style of leadership that was going to be much more important for a Republican government later on. It was a very different kind of a relationship than you would get, for example, in the British Army, where there was no explaining, there were orders, and for those that didn't respond, there were punishments.
In the British Army, they were flogging soldiers and sailors with the greatest cheerfulness. That's what you did to a soldier if he misbehaved. You flogged him. In the Continental Army, Washington is always going on trying to persuade people, and of course, criminals in the army would be hanged or shot, but the armies ran on completely different principles. So you had an army in which discipline was maintained by flogging against an army in which discipline was really ultimately maintained by exhortation.
Remember, soldiers, you are free men, fighting for the blessings of liberty. Remember that you and your descendants will become slaves if you do not acquit yourselves like men. Remember Boston and Charlestown. The enemy discovered at great cost what a few brave men, fighting for their own land, for the best of causes, could do against soldiers for hire.
The notion of having a population that is personally engaged in war is really new. The great European powers in the 18th century built their power not on a bunch of enthusiastic soldiers, but rather on professional, rather mercenary forces that they'd recruited and paid to actually harness popular enthusiasm and to make it militarily effective. That is new.
Washington and his army have retreated to Harlem Heights, 7 miles north of the city. He realizes that he must completely change tactics. Until he has more experienced soldiers, he will engage the enemy only in small skirmishes and quick retreats.
As we go forward, the rebels fly before us. It's impossible to catch them. They'll neither fight nor totally run away. They seem to be playing hide and seek with us, always hovering a day's march away.
Washington hates following a strategy of retreat. But he knows that the Continental Army must be preserved at all costs. Along with Congress, the Army is America's only national institution, the glue that holds the country together.
With the fate of America at stake, I see our job as prolonging this war as much as possible. So unless we are absolutely forced into it, our tactics are to avoid a large battle. In fact, to avoid any risks at all.
This constant retreating is hard on Washington and the soldiers. They are exhausted and frustrated. 1/5 of the army has dysentery.
The whole time is spent in marches, especially night marches. They're watching, starving, freezing, and sickness. If we get any chance to rest, it'll be in the woods. Any place but someplace comfortable, lying on the wet ground. And if you close your eyes in a moment's sleep, an alarm. You stand guard for an hour or two, or you're under attack from the enemy and you have to march another 5 miles.
Joseph Plum Martin cannot wait to go home. His enlistment will be up in 2 months, along with all the rest of the army. Recruiting posters go up everywhere.
To all brave, healthy, able-bodied, and well-disposed young men, take notice. Those who may favor this recruiting party with their attendance will have the opportunity of spending a few happy years in viewing the different parts of this beautiful continent in the honorable and truly respectable character of a soldier, after which he may return home to his friends with his pockets full of money and his head covered with laurels. God save the United States.
But a losing general will attract few new enlistments. And Washington has already lost Long Island, New York City, and much of Westchester. Washington proposes something new, offering money and land to recruit soldiers for long-term enlistments. John Hancock replies to Washington.
Sir, Congress is resolved to help you in the present critical state of our affairs. In order to give you all possible assistance in keeping the Army together, Congress has appointed a committee. With every sentiment of esteem and respect, your very humble servant, John Hancock.
Congress can do very little beyond forming committees. All political power remains with the individual states. Congress has no authority to tax, no way of raising money to supply or pay the army.
Washington spent a very frustrating war, there's no doubt about it, in many ways. And among the greatest of his frustrations was dealing with Congress, a Congress that could not meet his basic needs, that could not even guarantee him an army that would be there a year from now, a Congress that periodically dissolved. And yet, Washington was so committed to the rule of civilian authority over the military that he was willing to absorb those blows, to deal with those frustrations. It is a measure of Washington's character, political skill, and I would say idealism, that he could put up with this Congress and never lose sight of the larger objective.
The Americans have one stronghold left on the whole of Manhattan, Fort Washington. The fort holds most of the heavy artillery of the Continental Army. The Americans are convinced that the fort is impregnable. But the British smash its defenses in one brilliantly coordinated attack. The capture of the precious stores in Fort Washington is a disaster for the Americans. Over 100 cannon, thousands of muskets, and 400,000 cartridges. These are all manufactured in England, and the Americans have no hope of replacing them. The British follow up with an attack on Fort Lee on the other side of the Hudson River. Washington watches the fall of the two forts. 3,000 American soldiers are dead or captured. It is the tragic finale to a 3-month string of catastrophes.
To John Augustine Washington, if I were to put a curse on my worst enemy, it would be to wish him in my position now. I just do not know what to do. It seems impossible to continue my command in this situation, but if I withdraw, all will be lost.
The front has moved to New Jersey. General Howe now gives the Americans another chance to surrender with honor. He offers New Jersey citizens a royal pardon if they will renounce the rebel cause. In just 2 weeks, 3,000 Americans accept the offer, including a signer of the Declaration of Independence.
There are a lot of Americans who think it is time to give up in late 1776, that they've made the best effort they could, but that the British Army, with the British Navy behind it and the British economy behind that, are just simply too strong.
December 1776. All of New Jersey is now in the hands of the British, who are garrisoned along the northern bank of the Delaware River, 30 miles from Philadelphia. Congress has fled to Baltimore. General Howe declares the war over for the winter. It is common in the 18th century to avoid fighting in winter. Armies face impassable roads, perilous half-frozen rivers, disease and starvation. Animals are a particular problem.
A human being is tougher, much tougher, than a horse or even an ox. A human being can go longer without food as long as he has water than an animal can. An 18th century army finds it very difficult to do anything in those months when there's no grass in the fields, no fodder for the horses. You can't feed the animals.
General Howe, comfortably settled in New York City, has begun the elegant winter season of balls and banquets. The talk of the town is about an affair he is having with a certain Mrs. Loring, the wife of one of his officers. Washington has retreated from New Jersey to Pennsylvania. It has turned bitterly cold. His soldiers have no tents and little winter clothing.
No food for 2 days. Pinched with hunger. I come across an oxtail that somehow escaped the dogs. I steer off to my tent with this prize, where I throw it on the fire and broil it. It's not long on my stomach before it starts to show a great inclination to be set at liberty again. I become more and more willing to listen to its requests. And with tears at parting with what I thought was my friend, I give it a discharge. It's a while before I'll eat oxtail again.
Washington himself is now engaged in a personal battle for survival. Among the Army's top generals, there is open talk of replacing him.
Washington's attitude in late 1776 is one more of desperation than anything else. He's thinking that probably he'd be better send instructions back to his own estate and make provisions for the British winning the war. So there's not much on his mind except survival well into the month of December in 1776. Things look really bad, very bad indeed.
To John Augustine Washington, I have begged Congress again and again to send me soldiers with long-term enlistments. All I get back is delays and quarrels. Then the state send me officers who aren't fit to polish boots. John, I'm sick to death of what is going on. Every day things get worse. Congress botches things up, and I get blamed.
We have a report from an informant close to Washington's family. The general looks extremely dejected. He spends much of his time alone. People who have walked in on him found him in tears. His army has no blankets, none of the necessities of life. They're even out of salt. I have corroborated these facts with other informants.
Christmas is approaching. John Hancock sends Washington a gift, a barrel of his wife's salted fish.
To John Hancock, my grateful thanks for the salted fish. I'm very fond of salted fish, but never think of it until it is placed before me. I hope you have not gone to too much trouble sending it to camp on my account. My compliments to Mrs. Hancock. George Washington.
The fate of the United States now rests on Washington and 6,000 men. The first army in modern history to be fighting for a political ideal is facing its darkest moment. Traveling with the weary, exhausted soldiers is Tom Paine, the brilliant British writer whose pamphlet Common Sense had convinced many Americans to embrace independence. On a drumhead, he writes one of the most quoted essays in the English language. It is called The American Crisis. Washington immediately orders all of his officers to read it to their troops. He hopes its words will inspire them to hold on for just a little longer.
These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will in this crisis shrink from the service of their country.
But they that stand it now deserve the love and thanks of men and women.
Tyranny, like hell, is not easily conquered. But the harder the conflict, the more glorious the triumph.
Heaven knows how to put a proper price on its goods. It would be strange indeed if so celestial an article as freedom should not be highly rated.
I fear not. I see no cause of fear. In the end, we will be the victors. For though the flame of liberty may sometimes cease to shine, the ember will never expire.
It is just before Christmas. The soldiers' terms of enlistment will be up on December 31st. In 1 week, Washington will be a general without an army. Across the Delaware River from the Americans, in the small town of Trenton, New Jersey, the Hessian Colonel Johann Rall and his brigade prepare to celebrate the holidays. Rall is in high spirits. He gives little thought to the American forces camped just across the river.
We don't need trenches or fortifications. The rebel soldiers, those country clowns, they're almost naked, dying of cold, have no provisions, no blankets. Let them come. We shall welcome them with our bayonets.
Washington decides to risk all his troops in a surprise offensive. Horses and cannon and the remains of his army will cross the half-frozen Delaware River in the middle of the night and launch an attack on the Hessian camp at Trenton. It's his last roll of the dice. All or nothing.
The key is absolute secrecy. We do not really have enough men for the task, but we have no choice. Coordinate with Griffin and attack on as many of their posts as possible. The more confusion we can spread, the better.
December the 23rd, new orders. We are moving out with 3 days' rations. General Washington has just given the password for this operation. Victory or death.
The plan is to move 2,500 men and 18 field guns across the river. Seems impossible. It's cold and stormy. Ice is floating in the river. The troops march to the boats in the most profound silence.
Christmas, 3 a.m. All the troops have crossed the river and the boats have gone back for the artillery. I've never seen Washington so determined. He stands on the bank of the river, wrapped in his cloak, overseeing the landing of his troops, calm and collected.
We begin our march to Trenton. The horses pulling the cannon slip and slide. They're without shoes. So are the soldiers. The road to Trenton is literally marked with the blood of the soldiers' feet.
A great commotion near the meeting house. A Hessian running out from the house, yelling in German. 3 or 4 others come out with their guns. Bullets whistle over our heads.
The surprise is complete. Rall and his regiment are drunk and asleep. By the time they realize what is happening, the trap is sprung.
The hurry, fright, and confusion of the enemy is a scene out of the Final Judgment. They try to form lines in the streets, but our howitzers are already in place. They run behind the houses to hide, but we go after them with muskets.
Commander Rall tumbles from his horse. His soldiers throw down their guns. We take 1,200 prisoners.
Colonel Rall, who was, he was a great fighter, but he was also a great drinker and a great braggart. It's interesting that Christmas night, he was at a party, and a man came to the door to see him. He said, "It's very urgent, I've got to see him, let him know." And Rall wouldn't bother seeing him, so finally the man wrote a note, and they gave it to Rall, and they found it in his pocket after he died 2 days later. and it said the Americans are coming to attack you tomorrow morning. He never bothered to read it.
The victory at Trenton is a startling reversal of fortune. Washington follows up with the defeat of a British brigade in the town of Princeton, 10 miles away. Suddenly, the whole psychological picture of the war has changed.
Actually, Trenton is a small skirmish. The British generals, who read their comment at the time, they're saying, how tiresome. But they don't regard it as being that serious in itself. You know, these things happen in war.
Well, in military terms, it isn't a big deal. You lost 1,000 Germans, but you can always go hire another 1,000 Germans. But it's extremely important on the American side. As the news spreads to all the colonies, there is a feeling that it may indeed be possible to reverse the course of this war.
New Jersey civilians who had signed a loyalty oath to the king come back to supporting the revolution. Volunteers from all 13 states are rushing to fill the ranks of the dwindling army. And Washington, whose very command had been in doubt only a few days before, now becomes a national hero.
This Washington is certainly a most surprising man, natural-born general. The fact that this Negro-driving plantation owner can muster together some ragged beggars, the refuse of other nations, and keep England's most experienced soldiers at bay is, well, astonishing. Our country's finest chased by a tobacco planter. Poor old England, how thy laurels have tarnished.
From that point, he seems to be able to do no wrong. Washington, after these two little military victories, seems to exemplify the revolution. He is the revolution.
June 1777. British troops assemble on the banks of the Richelieu River. They plan a major attack on the United States from the north. It is an enormous force, led by the dashing, theatrical, larger-than-life General John Burgoyne.
I can't ask for anything better than this army of professionals. The mob of undisciplined provincials won't have a chance against them. I have instructed the officers to count on the bayonet. The rebels can't stand up against the bayonet. They hide behind trees, relying on their rifle pieces.
Gentleman Johnny Burgoyne was a socialite general, a young man about town, charming, innumerable friends, very competent playwright. Burgoyne, better playwright than general. His farces are still worth listening to.
In England, Horace Walpole, a political insider, comments,
Ah yes, Burgoyne the pompous. He's the natural son of Lord Bingley, but he did not inherit any of his estate. He's a gambler. Some say he cheats, but in fact he plays very well. I heard him speak in Parliament. He never impressed me much with his brilliance, but he's a useful commander. He feeds the press and the public with many exciting accounts of his exploits. He's as noisy as Howe is quiet.
Burgoyne's master plan is for two British armies to seize control of the Hudson River, one attacking down from Canada, the other up from New York City. This would isolate New England from the rest of the colonies.
This is the famous Hudson, Lake Champlain, Richelieu corridor, which is one of the most fought-over places on Earth. Everybody knew that if you could get control of it, you then were master of the northeastern United States. And it was particularly important for the British to have control of it, because then they could use Quebec, Montreal at one end and New York at the other as their two main bases, and just shoot up and down the corridor. And New England and most of New York would be cut off from the rest of what we'll call the United States. It wasn't yet the United States, but the rest of the United States.
A young soldier fighting with Burgoyne, Sergeant Roger Lamb, keeps a diary of his experiences.
This is going to be a critical expedition. General Burgoyne tells us to get ready. Ready for hard work. Ready to give our lives. We must not retreat.
The soldiers board ships, and Burgoyne's armada sets sail. Their destination is Albany. In New York City, General Howe is making preparations for some large operation. George Washington is with the main American army in New Jersey, watching and waiting for Howe's next move.
General Howe's strange maneuvers puzzle us beyond measure. One day his ships seem ready to head up the Hudson. The next day they seem headed toward Philadelphia. I'm completely perplexed as to what his real design is. Our conduct must be governed by his. If we can keep General Howe at bay, I think any success that Mr. Burgoyne has will be partial and temporary.
Burgoyne's army travels down Lake Champlain, a smooth 3-week sail. On July 1st, they arrive at what everyone considers the single largest obstacle of the campaign, Fort Ticonderoga. The fort dominates a narrowing in the lake. No invaders can get their boats past this point without coming within range of the fort's deadly cannon. This stronghold is being defended by 2,000 heavily armed Americans. Overlooking Ticonderoga is Mount Defiance. It is steep and rugged. Nobody imagines that it can be fortified. But in an extraordinary feat of military engineering, Burgoyne's soldiers managed to cut a path up its back slope. The following morning, the Americans are stunned to see British guns trained down on them. They realize that the fort is indefensible and flee for their lives.
It was a very emotional deal for the Americans. Fort Ticonderoga stood as the great bastion to stop invasions from the north. And suddenly, the British were able to breach it. And this had a tremendous impact on America. The tie had broken, and the British were streaming down the Champlain Valley. It looked like all was lost.
Torrents of success. The opposition is swept away, all of us. Officers and men see the end in sight. Albany within our grasp. New England finally submitting to British rule.
To Lord Germain, nothing can now stop us on our passage to Albany. Credit for this victory goes to my officers and superior equipment. My merit is small. After we take Albany, I request the King's leave to return to England. My constitution is not fitted for the American winter.
In London, an ecstatic King George III gets the news of the fall of Ticonderoga.
I beat them. I have beat the rebels.
It was a long-standing tradition for enlisted men, in order to keep them in the army, to be allowed to bring their dependents with them. The women in the camp did all the housekeeping chores. They cooked, they cleaned, they nursed, they foraged. They were essential in many ways for the survival of the army.
High-ranking officers and their families live in style. Baroness Frederica von Riedessel is traveling with her husband, the commander of the Hessian troops.
I sent back most of my baggage and have kept only a small summer wardrobe. As we were going to be traveling further, I had a small carriage built with seats for my 3 children and the servants. So we are traveling in the midst of the soldiers, who are merry, singing songs and burning with a desire for victory. General Burgoyne, he likes to make himself comfortable. He spends most of the night singing and drinking and cavorting with the wife of one of his officers, who is his mistress. She is as fond of champagne as he is.
One of the great mysteries of Burgoyne is how he thought he could carry
both his army and all of the baggage and so many what seemed to us superfluous people with him down the back country. I mean, he had 30 carts with his personal possessions, including several cases of champagne and changes of clothing. It seemed totally inappropriate to this situation.
Burgoyne is moving through a vast wilderness. This is hostile territory. Every hill, every river presents unseen hazards. To guide him to the Hudson River, Burgoyne has recruited a force of Iroquois Indians.
Both sides, both the British and the colonials, were working for the participation of the Iroquois in the war, although officially they were supposedly urging the Iroquois to remain neutral and stay out of this white man's war.
When it came time for the Indians to choose between the Americans and the British, most Indian peoples found it easy to choose the British instead of the rebellious Americans. For generations, they had been living side by side with the Americans, and they didn't actually like the Americans very much. The Americans tended to move in on Indian lands without asking permission and without having a treaty. It was the British who had tried to keep this kind of land encroachment to a minimum or to eliminate it altogether.
Native American people fought for their own homes. They realized that if the colonists won, that their lands would be overrun. They had no great alliance or great support of the British government, but they realized that the British government was their only hope here in defending their homeland against the colonists. It was the lesser of two evils, but it certainly was the preferred choice.
Those Indian nations which joined the British have sent Burgoyne 400 of their finest warriors. They will be his scouts, the eyes and ears of the invasion. Only 23 miles separate Lake Champlain from the Hudson River. 23 miles of dense, primeval forest of enormous pines and maple trees. Burgoyne's mile-long train of carts, pulled by pack animals, must somehow hack its way through this seemingly endless wilderness. Geography becomes his worst enemy.
People back home can't imagine what this country is like. Hundreds of rivers and lakes. And a person can wander 1,000 miles without meeting another human being. The porcupines are the size of a small dog. Tasty when roasted, like a suckling pig.
Europeans had long since devastated their forests. So when they come to America, they see all of these trees. They're overwhelmed by the forests. There was no New York thruway to come down on. They had to hack their way through forests and trails. And it was a excruciating experience. It took them months.
The route must cross deep ravines, swamps and bogs. Burgoyne's soldiers must build 40 bridges and causeways, some over 2 miles long. Progress is excruciatingly slow, less than 1 mile a day. For the Hessians, this is their first taste of the American wilderness.
If I weren't here, I would have never believed that such a terrible place as this exists in the world. It's hot and sticky in the day, and at night it is cold and foggy. Last night we had thunderstorms with much heavier thunder and lightning than I've ever experienced in Germany. In camp we are constantly waging war against the flies. At night, snakes come visit us in our tents. I cannot describe how terrified I am of them.
In New York City, the other British general, William Howe, is loading supplies and 18,000 of his troops onto ships. Washington, with the main army in New Jersey, watches helplessly as Howe's troops set sail. On a clear July day, the Armada disappears over the horizon.
All he knew when Howe left in the fleet sailing out of New York Harbor was that Howe had gone out of New York. Where was he going to show up? Was he going to be at Philadelphia? Was he going down to Chesapeake Bay? Washington had to move his army to counter Howe. And he had men all along the eastern seaboard. He possibly might be going down to Charleston. He didn't know. But he had to keep his army mobile and ready to chase Howe to counter wherever he showed up.
Unable to spare any men, Washington makes an appeal to the New England militia to stop Burgoyne's advance.
Gentlemen, General Burgoyne's plan is to cut communications between the northern and southern states. He must be speedily and vigorously opposed. We are looking to your militia for support. Every motive of self-preservation, of liberty and happiness has a claim on your efforts. General Washington.
They wait. September 19th. Burgoyne's troops march into a clearing at Freeman's Farm. They see no American soldiers. Suddenly, from the surrounding woods, they hear a strange sound. Turkey gobbling. It is the secret code of Daniel Morgan's Rifle Corps. Their order, in flagrant breach of 18th century military etiquette, is to aim directly at the officers.
Several Americans place themselves in high trees, and when they see a British officer's uniform, they kill him by deliberately aiming at his person. Men, and particularly officers, drop on either side of me. The Americans too have heavy losses, but more and more of their reinforcements keep arriving.
Burgoyne is astounded. Not only has a huge army assembled from nowhere, worse, the Americans, whom he has called a mob of undisciplined provincials, are clearly able to fight. Burgoyne sends a frantic message to General Howe, who he assumes is still in New York.
The American army now between us and Albany outnumbers us. No operation, my lord, has yet been undertaken from New York to support us. There is no movement up the Hudson River. I never dreamed I would be left to make my way through this hostile countryside, surrounded by enemies, without any cooperation from New York. Burgoyne!
What was supposed to happen with Burgoyne and Howe in 1777 is a puzzle which historians have been teasing out ever since it happened, and it's still very far from clear. If Howe had seriously thought that Burgoyne's campaign depended on him, it wouldn't have been very difficult to make a detachment up the Hudson River to help him. Conversely, if Burgoyne had imagined that his success depended on what Howe was doing, one supposes he might have taken some steps to inform Howe of exactly where he intended to be and when, which he didn't.
Howe is having troubles of his own. His advance toward Philadelphia is meeting with stubborn resistance from Washington and the main American army. Howe fights and wins a fierce battle at Brandywine Creek. Both sides suffer heavy losses. Howe finally captures Philadelphia on September 26th. It is a hollow victory. Congress has fled.
In European terms, the capital is the seat of government, the seat of the monarch, and the mere threat of the loss of the capital would bring a government to terms. The same thinking must have influenced Howe's constant feeling that he ought to get Philadelphia, that Philadelphia was somehow the capital, whatever that might mean in America. And that this would perhaps be a solution and lead to a political settlement. But on the Americans went.
At Saratoga, Burgoyne is outnumbered 2-1, and the American forces continue to grow. He holds an urgent meeting with his generals. Baron von Riedesel and Simon Fraser urge him to retreat across the Hudson. Instead, Burgoyne orders another direct assault on the American army to force a passage to Albany.
Burgoyne was a gambler by temperament, loved gambling all his life. His temperament was not cautious. And as far as he was concerned, he was trying to execute a strategy which could work and which it was worth trying.
October 7th, 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The British begin their attack. The American response is weak. General Gates refuses to leave his tent.
The minute Burgoyne showed up, Gates didn't know what to do. Gates's strength was as a paper shuffler. He could administer and work at a desk. He just was not a fighter. Once the battle began, he was worthless, literally, on the battlefield.
Seizing the initiative in the field and leading the counterattack is the most brilliant and fearless general of the American Army, Benedict Arnold.
Arnold rides up and points his sword at the enemy. Morgan's men, urged on by Arnold, hurl themselves against the English and Germans with deadly fire from their rifles. I can't describe the bravery of Arnold on this battlefield. He's inspired with the fury of a demon.
3 years later, Arnold will become the Revolution's most famous traitor. But in 1777, at Freeman's Farm, he is its most heroic fighter. Arnold's horse is shot from under him. Seriously wounded, Arnold rallies his men to carry on the attack.
Arnold, as a field general, was electric to the men. And when he was there, they could do things no one else could get them to perform. And here he broke the line, the last line that Burgoyne had. With that, Burgoyne had to start to retreat.
The British officers, ignoring their own personal danger, lead their troops in one last stand.
General Fraser is hit. He was shot by a rifleman hiding in a tree. Everyone, from Burgoyne to the lowliest private, is stunned. He's faint, and he's losing blood. He asked if our army is defeated. We told him no. He appeared for the moment, pleased.
About 3 in the afternoon, we are waiting for our dinner guests. Instead, they bring in General Fraser on a litter. They clear the table and use it as a bed for the general. The ball has gone through the general's bowels. All night I hear him lying there, groaning. All fatal ambition, and poor General Burgoyne, and my poor wife. He dies at 8 o'clock the next morning.
The supply of rebels is inexhaustible. It's like Hydra's head. When you cut one snake off, 7 more spring up in its place. For 3 weeks, no one has slept through the night. We are running low on rations. To keep spirits up, I have ordered the distribution of the last 12 barrels of rum.
October 10th, 2 in the afternoon. We take refuge in the cellar. My children lie on the earth with their heads on my lap. The sounds of the battle are growing louder, and I am sitting in the corner, trembling. I am more dead than alive. not so much because of mine own danger as from worrying about my husband. Of all the women whose husbands have been killed or wounded, shall I be the only fortunate one?
We hear this huge sound, like the howling of dogs. At first we think it's a trick of the enemies, so we send out a detachment to reconnoitre. They come back and report to us. It's wolves. One sets up a cry when it finds a corpse. Then the others join it in that hideous sound as they rip it apart. The howling gets louder and louder.
On October 17th, in a field near Saratoga, the British lay down their arms. Burgoyne's entire army is taken prisoner. Gone are all his dreams of easy victory, honor, and glory.
General Gates met Burgoyne at the entrance to the camp. The fortune of war, General Gates, has made me your prisoner. Burgoyne drew his sword and handed it to Gates, who received it with a bow and returned it to its owner.
In their best military uniforms, with regimental colors flying, the British prisoners march into a clearing. They see, for the first time, the face of their conquerors. Row upon row of plainly dressed citizen soldiers, old men and young boys, free blacks, ordinary Americans. A British officer would write that he felt as if he were looking at a new race of men.
I rode post-haste from Nantes with the dispatches from America. I didn't have time to get off my horse when Franklin shouted to me, "Did Howe really take Philadelphia?" "Yes, sir," I said. And the poor gentleman sadly shook his head and was heading back to the house. I stopped him. "But, sir, I have greater news than that. General Burgoyne and his whole army are prisoners of war." The effect was electrical.
This is Franklin's moment of triumph. Saratoga has changed everything. He is finally received by the French court.
To Catherine Green, your troubles will not last much longer. We have formed a treaty with the French. This alliance will serve to keep the English bull quiet and make him behave himself. His horns have been shortened. Benjamin Franklin.
The Americans now have as their ally one of the great superpowers of the world. For the British, it is a different story. They now face the prospect of a world war.
From the point of view of the British government, that meant a real war. A real war against a real enemy, an enemy that spoke a foreign language, a dangerous enemy, an enemy that might invade, an enemy that might overthrow the kingdom. Not just troublesome political issues, not just expensive and complex colonial problems, but real serious mortal peril.
December 1779. The war in America has been going on for 5 years and is at a stalemate. For England, it has expanded into a world war with her archenemy France. British colonies around the world are under attack, and France seems poised to invade England itself. The American war has become a costly sideshow. The British are growing desperate. General Henry Clinton sets sail from New York. He leaves behind a garrison of troops to tie down Washington's army. His destination is Charleston, South Carolina, the commercial and political center of the American Lower South.
The decision to go south was really a last attempt. They'd failed in New England, they'd failed in the middle colonies as they regarded them, and where else could they go? The answer was that they could attempt to go south, that they could pacify the entire South, and then use that as a springboard from which they could reconquer the rest of the colonies.
Clinton lays siege to Charleston. The entire southern division of the American Army defends the city valiantly for 6 weeks. But in May, Charleston falls to the British. 16-year-old Eliza Wilkinson keeps a diary recording the events of the day.
A day of sorrow. I have seen my countrymen bound and dragged away. So many young men have died in her defense. Now America must fall. We are entirely at the mercy of the British soldiers. Even women are being sent to the prison ships. Do the Britons think that they'll conquer America this way? We may be led, but we'll never be driven.
The entire Southern Army is captured. Most of South Carolina falls into British hands. Georgia has been pacified, and North Carolina will soon follow. A delighted General Clinton reports back to London.
With greatest pleasure, I report to your lordship that inhabitants from every quarter rush to declare their allegiance to the king. I may venture to assert that there are few men in South Carolina who are not either in arms with us or our prisoners.
Since the beginning of the war, the British have issued 2 extraordinary proclamations offering protection to slaves who run away from their patriot masters.
They gave the African Americans the knowledge that they could become involved in this war, and that force could work toward their own freedom. They could work among the British, they would have occupations, they were paid by the British, and the march from plantations to the Clinton forces was for them a freedom march.
We ask for nothing more than is our right. We are the creatures of that God who made all nations of the earth of one blood and one kindred. We are no more obliged to serve you than you to serve us. The more we consider the matter, the more we are convinced we were not created to be slaves.
It became very apparent to British military leadership that racial manipulation might be used successfully to bring white Southerners to heel. It created widespread panic among white Southerners because every Southerner, whether he or she was a slave owner or a non-slave owner, feared the prospect of a massive slave uprising. They all felt their own vulnerability.
A Negro man named Charles ran off from me last night. I believe he intends to try to get to the British. He may prove resolute and daring if endeavored to be taken. His leaving was from no cause of complaint or dread of a whipping, for he has always been remarkably indulged. Indeed, too much so. But from a determination to get his liberty by flying to the British. He's very black, has a large nose, and is about 5 feet 8 or 10 inches high. I will give £5 to any person who secures him.
The British see the proclamations as a powerful weapon to destabilize the South. But the Patriots are determined to hold on to their slaves. They unite in opposition to the British.
And so in a great irony, the retention of this slave system becomes a significant objective of the revolution in the South. So we have a revolution in behalf of freedom and independence. And part of the freedom and independence is the maintenance of the slave system.
A victorious Clinton returns to New York, leaving the South under the command of General Charles Cornwallis, a 40-year-old aristocrat and professional soldier. Cornwallis is charged with executing the second part of the strategy to conquer the South. The British are aware that a large percentage of the population has never supported the revolution. For the first time in the war, the British intend to make these loyalists a key component of their war effort. The plan is to conquer an area and then put loyalists in charge.
The idea is that you send in a relatively small force, certainly far smaller than the force Howe took to Staten Island in 1776. You send in a relatively small force. That defeats whatever major unit, Patriot units you have in the area. And once those Patriot units have been defeated, the loyalists are encouraged to rise, to organize themselves in a militia, that militia will terrorize their opponents and in effect take over the civil government and produce resources and recruits for the British, and that this process will be extendable throughout the South. So it is a new strategy.
It is a strategy doomed from the start. The British have no idea that they are walking into a hornet's nest. Their loyalist allies have little enthusiasm for the British cause. They are mainly interested in revenge against the Patriots. The loyalists tend to be recent immigrants, poor Scots-Irish who have settled the back country. These new arrivals have been treated with contempt by the established, well-to-do gentry, and there is bad blood between them.
They're descended from Britons, perhaps, but they are one step removed from the brutes. There's no authority, no churches, schools, and no law. Fighting, brawling, fornicating are gloried in, practiced in the open noonday.
They calls us a pack of beggars. That Charleston gentry in their fine linens. And who were your ancestors a few years back?
The British armed these backwoods loyalists and put them into positions of power. The loyalists seize the opportunity to settle old scores. British soldiers are soon horrified by the actions of their southern allies.
We approach the farm and we see pastures littered with the carcasses of dead cattle and horses. We walk into the plantation house, but everything is silent. On the floor are the smashed fragments of porcelain figurines which had been collected by the owner. On the shelf in their stead, we see 5 severed human heads. And then... oh, the barbarians. There lay a pregnant woman murdered in her bed. They had cut open each of her breasts with stabs from their bayonets. And above the canopy they wrote in her own blood, "Thou shalt never give birth to a rebel."
Patriots fight back. They form partisan bands, burning farms, torturing and killing suspected Tories.
Friend and foe alike were often pillaged, and indiscriminately, people who had publicly declared their neutrality were pillaged by both sides. All sides were involved, and all sides were guilty of the cruelest barbarities against one another.
I come home after 6 months of hunting Tories, and there is the wreckage of our farm. And I find Mother. They tied her up and whipped her. She's a widow, but they stole everything they could and burned the house. I join up with another company, and we go to the house of a Tory named Campbell. And we capture a few of them. We shoot a fellow named McPherson, and Campbell was spicketed. It works like this. First, we hammer a sharp pin through a block of wood, and then it was Tom Archer. He got hold of Campbell and he pushed his foot on the spike. And then he turns him round and round till the pin runs clear through his foot. Cruel, you think? I loved seeing Campbell spicketed. We figured he was part of the gang that horsewhipped a helpless widow. What had she ever done except telling her son to be true to the cause?
The British strategy of using loyalists to pacify the South is proving to be disastrous. Cornwallis is frustrated and perplexed.
If the Loyalists allow themselves to be plundered and their own families ruined by these rebel bandits, how do they expect us to protect them?
In 1780, George Washington is with the main American forces outside of New York, locked in a stalemate with the British Army stationed in the city. He and his soldiers have suffered 2 devastating winters at Valley Forge and Morristown. His thoughts turn to his beloved Mount Vernon, which he hasn't seen in 6 years. He writes to his cousin managing the estate.
I wait here with impatient anxiety for news from the South. I can do nothing. Do you have any prospects of getting paint? I trust you have taken care of the fallen trees and the hedges. How many lambs do you have this spring? Write me how many horses I now own. Mrs. Washington tells me that she's taken a fancy to a horse belonging to James Cleveland. If he is as fine a horse as is claimed, try to get him. I shall be very pleased if you do.
1780 was a low point because both militarily and politically things look bad. There's no money. States are broke, and the army is in terrible condition, not being supported. So I think you have a lot of disillusionment and real feeling that maybe we've made a terrible mistake. I think there was that, in that sense, psychologically, it was a low point as well.
At this moment, Washington and the country get devastating news. General Benedict Arnold, Washington's most brilliant general and one of the Revolution's greatest heroes, has become convinced that the Americans are losing the war. He has gone over to the British.
Arnold was an incredible figure in the minds of the Americans. This was not just a general that led an army. This was one who had accomplished incredible feats at Fort Ty, in front of Quebec, at Valcour Island, at Saratoga. And it was an incredible blow on the Americans' belief in themselves. If Arnold has turned traitor, what else can happen to us? Can we last? Can we survive?
It was the great betrayal of Washington's wife. I don't think he ever got over it. And yet, Washington, for all the gloom in the 6th year of the war, never lost faith, at least publicly, and that's what counted. Washington understood this was not a military conflict in the conventional, certainly the old world sense. This was ultimately a test of political endurance. And while he, by temperament and inclination, would prefer to play the part of the lion, he learned to play the fox brilliantly. He only fought 9 battles in the Revolution, of which he only won 3. His genius was in keeping the cause alive, in keeping the army, such as it was, together. It was that endurance that made him, even at the time, a legend.
Washington has one great hope: his alliance with the French. King Louis's money is sustaining the war effort, and France is now America's principal source of military supplies. Muskets, gunpowder, even uniforms. The American army is flooded with idealistic foreign volunteers, many of them noblemen. The German Baron Wilhelm von Steuben, the Polish Colonel Tadeusz Kosciuszka, Count Casimir Pulaski. The most famous of them is a young, enthusiastic, and very well-connected French aristocrat named Marie-Joseph Paul Yves Roch Gilbert du Motier. Americans know him as the Marquis de Lafayette. At age 19, Lafayette had become one of Washington's most trusted aides. He has returned to France to promote support for the revolution and writes Washington frequently.
Be so kind, mon cher général, as to present my best respects to your lady. Do not tell her, but I have a wife who is madly in love with you. Well, my feelings for you are too strong, but I can't object to her feelings. And indeed, all of Europe wants to see you so much that I have boldly affirmed that you will pay me a visit after the peace is settled. Oh, mon cher général, how happy I will be to embrace you again.
Washington's royal admirer, Lafayette, is a young man of royal birth with liberal politics and what Jefferson later called a canine appetite for fame. Someone said he was a statue in search of a pedestal. But he was intoxicated with a love, a rather theoretical love, of liberty. It was theoretical because liberty wasn't known to many Europeans. But he was a great romantic, and he fell in love with America, the concept of America that the French had, this wild new world where you could start the world over, to use Tom Paine's phrase. And he came to America, and he became, in effect, a surrogate son to Washington.
I think that Washington, when he met Lafayette, was charmed by this Gallic joie de vivre, by this very exaggeration and exuberance that this very young Lafayette, he was only 19 when he arrived in America, had. And I'm sure Lafayette had the best possible influence on loosening up Washington.
My dear Marquis, you invite me to visit France after independence. Remember, my friend, I don't speak your language, and I am too old to learn it. I cannot bear the idea that I would appear awkward and insipid in front of the ladies, especially in front of your young wife. Convey to her, in any event, my most tender affection, and don't be afraid of a rival. Alas, in all of history, there's no example of a young woman preferring an old man if she follows her own real inclinations. George Washington.
Lafayette meets with Louis XVI and secures for Washington what he most wants from the king, a regiment of French troops to be sent to America. Lafayette fully expects to be the commander of this army. He is disappointed when King Louis chooses instead a far more experienced general, Count Jean-Baptiste de Rochambeau. Rochambeau is horrified by what he finds in America.
To the Prince de Montbarret, Minister of War. Monsieur, the country is ruined. They have nothing, not a single coin. Washington's army grows and shrinks from moment to moment. Sometimes he claims he has 15,000 troops, sometimes only 3,000. Send men, money, and ships. But don't count on any help from these people.
Rochambeau and his 6,000 soldiers station themselves at Newport, Rhode Island, and wait for reinforcements. Privately, Rochambeau is convinced that the Americans are near defeat.
I am alone, far from friends, surrounded by enemies. A British officer comes to pay a call. He's very good looking, but I remain stiff. He asks me to give him a tune on my guitar. I tell him I can play nothing but rebel songs. Fine, he says, smiling. Let's have one of them. Not today, I answer. I won't play for you. Are you going to put me in prison? I turn away and I'm very sullen. How long are you going to be like this, pretty Miss Wilkinson, he asks. Until my countrymen return, sir. Return as what, miss? As subjects of the king, or as prisoners? Why, sir, I answer smiling. Return as conquerors. He affects a laugh.
Then, on August 14th, events take a sudden and surprising turn. Rochambeau receives a bulletin from the French Admiral Count de Grasse in the Caribbean. He immediately passes the news to Washington.
Count de Grasse will be arriving in the Chesapeake area with 29 warboats, 3,000 troops, several dozen field guns, and £1,200,000 in cash. Because of obligations in the islands, this force will be available to us only until October 15th. We must make use of it promptly and efficiently.
De Grasse's ships and troops will be coming to Virginia, close to where Cornwallis is camped. Because hurricane season is approaching, they will be available for 2 weeks only. Washington leaps into action. Coordinating with Rochambeau, he makes plans to rush their best troops south to Virginia to meet up with de Grasse's fleet.
The French and the Americans are planning an operation in order to destroy the British position in Yorktown. Now, they know that the only way to do that successfully is a combined operation. And a combined operation is incredibly difficult. It means you've got to have the troops and the ships and also the seaborne artillery, which is another crucial element of it because the artillery is too heavy to move overland. And they've all got to arrive in the same area to provide a local superiority on force, both on land and at sea, at the same moment.
Washington and Rochambeau begin a month-long march south. Lafayette is camped in Williamsburg, near Yorktown. He sends Washington detailed reports.
Lord Cornwallis is entrenching at Yorktown. He is picking up whatever provisions he can get from the surrounding countryside. He has a large quantity of Negroes in town with him. They are working day and night on the fortifications. The moment I can get the plans, I will send them to you.
The French Admiral Count de Grasse arrives on schedule at the Virginia Capes. He is met by a fleet of British ships coming to Cornwallis's aid. They engage in a fierce 2-hour battle. Outnumbered, the British fleet retreats to New York for reinforcements. When Washington and Rochambeau arrive outside of Yorktown, the French Navy controls the Chesapeake. Rochambeau sends his greetings to de Grasse.
I must confess, you are, mon cher Amiral, the most wonderful admiral that I know. You have surpassed everything we could want. Now we are preparing for our own equally good piece of work. Tomorrow we will move as close as possible to Yorktown. And then our troops will just wait for the pear to ripen. We will, of course, yield precedence to the Americans. We will allow them to claim the victory.
Cornwallis's troops are camped on the river's edge. Facing them are the Allied French and American armies. To their rear, de Grasse's fleet.
They have blockaded Chesapeake Bay. Cornwallis can get no reinforcements. He really can't move around because you can send ships up virtually any river in Virginia and cut him off. So he's pinned in there, he can't get out. And the Allies have Chesapeake Bay as a giant superhighway to bring men and guns and food and all the other things necessary to fight a battle.
This is the moment that Washington has been waiting for. The Allies command 17,000 troops. The British, only 9,000. Washington's troops are ready for action. In the 5 years of the war, they have become the disciplined army he has always wanted. Among the soldiers is a young man who had fought in the first major battle of the Revolution as a raw recruit. Joseph Plum Martin is now a seasoned veteran of numerous campaigns.
They told us that we're about to pay a visit to our old friends, the British. Their accommodations are cramped, and I fear that they're not ready to receive so many visitors, but we've come such a long way to see them. We're just not going to be put off by their excuses.
Cornwallis sends a dispatch to Clinton, suggesting that he hurry up the reinforcements. Clinton replies that rescue is on the way.
5,000 soldiers are on the King's ships. Joint operations will commence in a few days to relieve you.
While they wait, Cornwallis's men furiously dig trenches in preparation for the Allied assault. His black auxiliaries do much of the heavy labor.
Working hard in the heat. The works will soon be in a tolerable state of defense. The army is in good health. We have 6 weeks' provisions.
The French and Americans prepare for a siege. They dig trenches encircling the town. Rochambeau, an expert at siege warfare, guides the activities. The British soldiers watch with increasing alarm.
I try to warn the Earl of the weakness of our defences. I show him how I can just jump over the earthworks. It will disgrace our army to fall in a siege. If that happens, he answers coldly. The blame will be on Clinton, not on us.
The bombardment of Yorktown now begins in earnest. The French cannon pound the British defenses day and night. When the British are weak enough, the Allies advance their lines, bringing the cannon ever closer.
It's almost an exercise in mathematics in which you aim to break up the enemy's attack and you want to get it so you can shoot at him from as many sides as possible. So it's a very structured and formal activity, much like the way that a boa constrictor deals with its victims. They grasp them, weaken them, let up a little, and then grasp them tighter until eventually they have their dinner. And a siege is like that. Once one is properly undertaken, unless there is some outside intervention, the people besieging the town are going to win.
The siege began. It lasted week after week. And as it lasted, Cornwallis's provisions began to grow very short. In order to prevent his horses from starving to death, they had to be slaughtered and thrown into the river.
And he did with the African Americans something very similar to what he did with the horses. His men were starving, and they wanted every ounce of food for his men, and so they simply drove them out of the camp.
The black auxiliaries are forced into the no man's land between the fighting armies.
It's harsh. Our black friends have served our army well, and now we drive them out by force between firing guns. Now they will have to face the reward of their cruel masters. No, I can't talk about what we are doing to them.
The Americans and French position themselves to advance on the British outer defenses.
The password for tonight is the name of the French commander, Rochambeau. Easy to remember, Rochambeau. And it sounds just like Rush on, boys. The signal is given. We silently move on the redoubts, bayonets fixed. The enemy sees us and begins firing. I hear people crying, "The redoubts are ours!" There's no stopping us. In we go. It really is. Rush on, boys!
By now, the Americans and French are just outside the final barricades. Yorktown is ready to be taken. On the 17th of October, 1781, the British send up a flag of truce.
Needless to say, the victorious colonials are in a mood to celebrate and to rub in their victory. Washington, the consummate actor, dramatically appears on a charger, riding up and down the American lines, forbidding them to engage in any demonstration, and shouting, "Posterity will huzzah for us."
The play is over. The fifth act has ended. I must confess I was a bit uneasy during the first 4 acts, but my heart keenly enjoyed this last one.
It is a warm October day. The leaves are already turning. The British surrender with their band playing. Their choice of music is unknown, but legend has it that the band played an old English ballad, "The World Turned Upside Down." If ponies rode men and grass ate cows, if summer were spring and the other way round, then all the world would be upside down.
They march out in formation, all armed, with bayonets fixed, drums beating, and faces lengthening. They don't pay much attention to us Americans, but when they see the French, their faces darken. They look like boys who've been whipped at school.
On October 24th, a huge British fleet arrives off the Chesapeake Capes. Clinton has made good on his promise, but it is 1 week too late. The French fleet has returned to the Caribbean. Cornwallis and his entire army are prisoners of the Americans. Yorktown is the biggest British disaster since Saratoga. The news reaches British essayist Horace Walpole.
Ah, yes, Cornwallis. That Columbus who was to bestow America on us again. For us to lose a second army, now this is an achievement. Well, here ends another volume in the American War. I would suggest that it's all over, but for the fact that there are 3 other wars that have grown out of it, and we're £40 million in debt.
It is not immediately obvious that the war is over. The English still hold New York, Charleston, and Savannah. With the French Navy out of the way, the British again rule the sea. But the British have bet everything on victory in the South. They must now accept that this is a war they can never really win. In Tom Paine's words, they cannot conquer an idea with an army.
British popular opinion, which had been so strongly in favor of the war at the beginning, had turned heavily and, as it turned out, irrevocably against the government. It's the same thing with other wars, of course. Long wars bring higher taxes, bring economic crisis, bring an interruption of trade, decline of property prices, and so on. All these things, and especially the fact that the war had become a world war against France, all of them created a crisis which public opinion would no longer tolerate.
Yorktown brings down the government. The opposition takes over, committed to ending the war. In 1783, 2 years after the defeat at Yorktown, a treaty is signed in Paris. The British signatories declined to pose for the official portrait. King George tries to console himself.
America seems to be a land of knaves. In the end, perhaps it is for the best that its inhabitants have become aliens to this kingdom.
But it is observed that when he announces the terms of the American treaty to Parliament, his voice chokes when he says the word independence.
The old man, our captain, came in and handed us our discharge papers. We didn't say much. We've lived together for 8 years. Young men with warm hearts, through hardships, dangers. A family of brothers. And now never to see each other again. It's a sad time. And by now everyone's heard the old story of the soldiers tracking the blood of their feet on the frozen ground. It literally happened. But you don't know 1,000th part of how we suffered. You never can.
"1783, the war is over, and the entire country celebrates. In the peace treaty with England, the Americans have gotten almost everything they asked for, from control of the West all the way to the Mississippi River, to the right to dry their catch of codfish on the shores of Nova Scotia. The soldiers are returning home, and people are filled with optimism about what the future will bring, the pursuit of happiness in a rich and plentiful land.
And I would love thee every day, every night we'd kiss and play, if with me you'd fondly stray, over the hills and far away.
I arrived home 14 days ago, after a very hard journey. The flax and spring wheat all dried up, but at least my orchard is full and blooming. I promised myself 40 barrels of cider. Mrs. Gilbert is a hearty woman. She's contented and happy now that I'm home, and only complains of one thing: the wolves. They howl through the night, disturbing her rest. Oh, why'd I have to sell my gun?
To our west lies land of inexpressible beauty and fertility. There, thousands of streams flow into the Mississippi, that prince of rivers, in comparison to which the Nile is but a rivulet, the Danube a mere ditch.
For Americans, the Wild West is only several hundred miles inland. Most of the continent is still peopled by Indian tribes. With the coming of peace, the way is now open for a steady stream of migration. In time, this will decimate Native American culture. But in 1783, most Indians have never even seen a white man. For the losers of this war, the several 100,000 Americans who had chosen to remain loyal to the crown, the American victory is a disaster. Many are forced to flee. Some go to Canada to start a new life, others to England. Many loyalists find that even here, in what they had always thought of as home, they do not really fit in.
November in London. Dark, heavy fog. No wonder British people hang themselves in winter. I spend my days as in a dream. thinking of the little cottage I left behind. What I would give right now for a Carolina peach. This is home, our mother country. Yet we are aliens here. The British are cold and formal. Perhaps I'm fit only for America, but there's no prospect of ever returning in safety. I must be content to finish my days among strangers.
Fighting a war which demanded the full participation of ordinary people has profoundly changed Americans. The old hierarchies are breaking down. Gone is the colonial world of deference.
When you end monarchy, you end the sense of being a subject, you end the sense of inequality pervading everywhere, and I think when you become a citizen, you're saying everyone is equal and not subject to anyone. You're equal to each other, and that had a pervasive effect. Servitude, for example, white servitude declined very rapidly and finally disappears altogether by 1800, whereas in the pre-revolutionary period, as many as half the population of Philadelphia had been, at one point in their lives, bonded servants. So you have a real change.
John Adams and his wife Abigail find themselves in England, surrounded by a world of wealth and privilege. Adams has just been appointed ambassador of the United States to the court of King George III. When he presents his credentials to the king, he is received politely. His wife Abigail is less than impressed by this old world of inherited power.
Dear sister, yesterday Mr. Adams and I visited the court of His Britannic Majesty. His Highness would look better if he did not drink so much. Her Majesty sits there stiff with diamonds. The whole family is inclined to corpulence. The princess is a short, clumsy miss of 15. The English boast of her beauty, but your simple American girl is much prettier. I stood there for 4 hours before His Gracious Majesty deigned to nod at me. Now I know to be looked down upon by sovereign pride is considered a mighty honor here, and I fear my expression was not sufficiently supplicant. There is a servility of manners here, a distinction between nobility and common citizens, which happily is foreign to Americans.
Peace. And a new scene opens. The object now is to make our independence work. To do this, we must secure our union on solid foundations. It's a job for Hercules, for we must level mountains of prejudice. Quit the sword, my friend. Put on the toga and come to Congress. We fought side by side to make America free. Let us, hand in hand, struggle now to make her happy.
Alexander Hamilton is sitting as a delegate in the Continental Congress. Illegitimate, born in the West Indies, he came to New York City as a teenager to be educated. Unlike most of his fellow citizens, Hamilton has no attachment to any local region. Brilliant and arrogant, this 28-year-old is absolutely convinced that he knows where this young country should be going.
Hamilton saw very quickly the potential for the United States, for the new nation to become a world leader. He believed that every potential was here: natural resources, population, the isolation from European intrigues and war. Hamilton believed in systematic planning and in the kind of ruthless wrenching of America from its pleasant agrarian attachments into a mercantile and then into a manufacturing society. And he was single-minded in his interest in making America all that it could be.
Americans are just beginning to have a national vision. Artists and writers are the first to give expression to this nationalism. They mythologize the revolution itself, producing epic paintings, heroic battles of the war, Franklin and Washington raised to the level of gods. In this spirit, a 25-year-old graduate of Yale, Noah Webster, sets to work writing a speller for a new language, American English.
We've been children long enough. We must unshackle our minds and begin to act like independent beings. Let's not waste our lives mimicking our parents from other nations. We now have our own empire to defend and a national character to develop.
Hamilton and Webster are the visionaries. Their nationalism is shared by only a small minority of their countrymen. Most Americans have never traveled more than 30 miles from the place where they were born. They view the world from a very local perspective.
There was great competition to establish your way of life as the better way of life. New Englanders, for instance, had fairly negative things to say about Southerners, who they thought of as decadent and as leisure-loving. They thought possibly the end of civilization was coming every time they saw a horse race or the men drinking or dueling or some activity that they considered to be not quite proper.
To the Southerners, the New Englanders seemed very suspicious and kind of plotting and not open and not very genteel. They're kind of crabbed, to use a word that they used. Of course, stereotypes are the way we understand people from other societies.
Freed from British control, each state pursues its own independent course. Each state adopts its own system of government and prints its own currency. Some use English pounds as the standard. Others use Spanish dollars. For most Americans, this local independence of the separate states is just fine. They are fiercely proud of their liberty to control their own fate. That's why they fought the Revolution, and this is what they have won. But during this time, all is not well with the country as a whole. At Mount Vernon, George Washington is receiving a series of letters from friends and former military men. Alexander Hamilton writes from Congress that without an army or a navy, America is completely powerless to deal with international problems.
England should have long ago returned our lands in the West. Spain blocks our ships from the Mississippi. How do we defend our rights as a country? Do we have troops, a national treasury, or even a national government? We have a shadow of a federal government where 13 petty republics must agree on every point of every measure the Union wants to execute. The result? Nothing happens. The states have brought the wheels of national government to a standstill.
You really see Hamilton tearing his hair and mumbling dirty whack-a-frass as the revolution ends, because the Confederation government to him is absolutely nothing that's going to build the America he wants it to be. He has no patience whatsoever with this loose agreement. He sees very clearly that the states are going to go back to squabbling with each other. He wants a uniform currency. He wants uniform internal trade within the country. And when he sees Rhode Island charging Massachusetts a tariff every time someone brings eggs from one state to the other, he's absolutely disgusted.
Sometimes I think I'm wasting my time in public service. I hate Congress. I hate the world. A mass of fools and knaves. I hate myself.
Border disputes smolder between the states. Pennsylvania is fighting with Connecticut over which state will control land to the west. It is clear that these might become full-fledged shooting wars. Observers in England smugly declare that all this is inevitable.
The popular opinion certainly believed that the American experiment couldn't possibly survive. It was remarkably liberal. The government was very weak. The country was very extensive. And there was really no possibility of this absurdly new, fresh government surviving more than a few years. It would disintegrate.
One underlying crisis overshadows everything else.
The United States was bankrupt. It had no ability to tax. All it could do was request the states to give it money. The financial situation was very, very serious, with huge war debts that had to be paid if you're going to restore the credit of the country.
The states are slipping into an economic depression. Americans are dividing into two camps, creditors and debtors.
We are oppressed by the very men whose property we fought for, whose independence we bled for. Yes, we owe money to these men, whose purses are their conscience, who hear their lust for wealth louder than the cries of the poor and the needy.
In 1786 in Massachusetts, the antagonism between the debtors and creditors breaks out into open conflict. Angry farmers arm themselves and march on the state courthouse in Springfield. The local militia join with the farmers. Daniel Shays, the leader of the insurgents, becomes a folk hero. Soon, debtor rebellions are breaking out in all 13 states. The debtors are by far the majority. The popularly elected legislatures pass laws which, in effect, cancel all debts, trampling on the property rights of the creditors.
I was as strong a believer in popular government as any man in America. But it is rapidly becoming the last kind of government I should choose. I'd even prefer a limited monarchy at this time. Better the whims of one man than the ignorance and passions of the mob.
Shays' rebellion shakes people's belief in popular government. There is now a rumor circulating through the states that Nathaniel Gorham, president of the Continental Congress, has approached Prince Henry of Prussia. "Our free institutions of government have failed," he is quoted as saying. "Will you please come to America and be our king?" Prince Henry is said to have reminded Gorham that Americans did not get along very well with their last king, and to have curtly declined the offer.